Jack Yeager was given, I think it was his daughter, and you had a son with
Bud Anderson.
With Bud Anderson.
How do you remember this stuff?
And we were chatting away at Oshkosh, and he said, I'd really like to fly with you. And I said, well, if you hang on to those armrests till your white knuckles, I said, that's what your experience is going to be, because you're going to say there's no way we can survive this with some of the maneuvers I was doing, very close to the ground. But I'd done them hundreds of times, and I knew I was safe. But if you were sitting in that passenger seat, I tell you, you're going to have white knuckles. And it just looks like there's no way to survive it. He rode through it smiling all the way, and it was the beginning of a great friendship that lasted.
Well, Bob, it is, and you all understand this, it has been an honor to know you ever since the first day we met, and it is just as much tonight. But let me take you back to that very moment, because I'm going to turn the story around just a little bit. And this is another reflection of Bob and his awareness of the people around him and his caring about the people around him. He's right that a son and daughter got in back seats of Mustangs with Chuck and Bud. And I was standing there, waving to my kids who were going up the Mustang the first time. And Bob looked over at me and said, well, your kids are flying. That means you ought to fly. Go get in the airplane. And I did. And it was an experience. Bob, in your entire career of flying, how many times did you think to yourself, well, maybe sometime they're going to do a bronze statue of me and put it in the museum in Washington?
I would never have dreamed, in my wildest dream, that this prestigious award would ever be placed upon me. And I'm very grateful and thankful to each and every one of you who have contributed not only with your heart and soul because of our friendship, but financially, and that hurts bad in the pocketbook.
Jack Daly mentioned a while ago about people getting sick when they learn to fly, which you did, of course, as a teenager, got sick. A lot of people get sick, as you know, but a lot of them quit, and they say, I can't do this. You didn't allow yourself to do that. Where did the Spirit come from? What was the Spirit that showed you knew you could overcome this, and, of course, you taught yourself to overcome it? What was that Spirit that made you do it?
Well, I had built model airplanes as a 6 or 7-year-old kid on up. They weren't flyable, but they were little kits you could buy for 10 or 15 cents, balsa wood, and you'd use tissue paper for the surface of the wings and stuff. And I was fascinated by the first Taylor Cub that I ever saw. It took him forever to go across the horizon where I lived. And when I saw that airplane, I thought, my gosh, he's up there looking down over those hills over there, and he knows what's on the other side of the hills. And I thought, boy, wouldn't it be nice if you could actually fly an airplane and be able to see things that we never see because the hills are in the way. And you can see that far. And as a youngster, I kept thinking about that, and that's what started me building little models, and I thought of them, but the World War II stuff, and I hung them up in my room, and my parents didn't know of my burning desire to fly an airplane, and I got a job at 16 in a grocery store, and it was during the Depression years, and my family had been like every other family with that Depression. Money was very scarce, and there were many people hungry in the streets and just begging for food. And my father hadn't been a man I could really admire. He had a regular high school education, and then he studied financing, and he called himself a bookkeeper, but now they'd call him executive of the monies in any corporation, and he was doing all of that. It would have a big fancy name with the vice president's level on it, but he always was very positive about buying everything and paying for it cash. And so when the Depression hit, his house was paid for, and he had bought one of the early Model T Fords. And suddenly, when it happened, people were starving to death. The company he worked for said they could only afford him for half-time. And so he would get up in the morning before daylight, walk a few blocks to get to a trolley car, catch it, and go downtown Nashville to his business office and work until noontime. And that's all they could afford to pay him. Everybody was hurting. And so he got another job with another company. So he was working at 2 jobs, and then he would get home late at night. And my mother would have dinner ready for him as soon as he came in the front door. And I'd get to see him a little bit during the dinner time, and then it was bedtime. So that was my early life during those Depression years. And I've always looked back on it and thought, what a wonderful thing that he believed in paying cash for everything. And you and I know that that's not always the best way nowadays to make a good amount of money in the course of a year. But it taught me the principle that if you don't have a burden hanging over your head, you can do a lot of things that you might not have been able to do otherwise. And I always admired him so much about everything he did. But that just gives you a little bit of my background. We didn't have the money to get gifts for everybody at Christmas time or anything during those Depression years. And when I got that first job in a grocery store, I earned $1.98 for 16 hours. And I decided after I had saved up $2, and I found I could get a flight lesson for $2. My parents wouldn't even let me get near the car to think about driving it. And I rode my bicycle 16 miles to the nearest airport because it was on the other side of the hills that I couldn't see over, and the Cumberland River, and no way to get across except bridges down in Nashville, Tennessee, in the town. So I'd go this way and then back. And it was really only about 4 miles away or 5 miles away from my home, but it took me 16 miles to get there. So I got in that airplane. Boy, I'd been dreaming of this. And as soon as those wheels left the ground, oh boy, I was blowing up inside. And I didn't want to mess up this new airplane, and so I was choking. And fortunately, the flight didn't last very long. And when he parked it, and he opened the side of the door that wasn't closed in completely, and just down to here, up to there, okay, propped up like this. And I ran to the weeds that was parked next to the hangar. And I ran to the weeds, tossed my cookies, and then I didn't know if I was going to be able to ride that bicycle home. I was so sick. And I then felt sorry for myself, and I thought, everything I dreamed of is gone at a young age. And I was 16, and I thought, I've got to conquer this. And if I worked hard at it, maybe I could someday overcome this. And so a couple of 3 months went by, and I kept thinking about my dream of someday flying, and that I would never be able to do it. And I thought, why don't you just tell yourself you can conquer any mountain? It can't get too tall for you. You can climb it if you really want to make it up to the top. And so I started taking lessons. And I still got sick every time I went in the airplane. And that continued. But I was fighting it. And my family had no idea I was learning to fly. And then finally, I got soloed, and when he told me to go, I said, I can't do it. I don't know how to fly. And he said, you just made 3 good landings, and you're on your own. I've taught you everything I know. And I said, but I can't do it. He said, I'm out of the airplane. I get going. We're wasting time. And I've got to do it. And I did it. And, of course, the rest is history.
And the rest is history. And we know that you flew. But by the time he conquered this and taught himself acrobatics and getting over being sick, he gets to flight school, and very quickly, as we all know, in the Army Air Corps, his chief instructor noticed that Bob was a better aerobatic pilot than any of his instructors. So they made Bob, as a recruit, he's just starting, the chief aerobatic instructor of all the students in flight school. But that gets to you're winged in 41 in the Air Corps, and you get over to the Med, and you want to go to combat, but what happens? They're uncrating airplanes in North Africa, and you're the test pilot. 40 types of aircraft, and for over many, many months you didn't get to combat. How frustrating was that?
Well, if I go backwards a little bit, I would like to start right where it occurred. When I went to this fighter unit to get checked out in fighters, because of my height, I had to go to bombers. So I was trained on twin engines. And that was because of my height. And anybody below 6 feet could go to fighters. But transports and bombers took all the tall people. And I wanted to be a fighter pilot. And they said, you're going to be a bomber pilot whether you like it or not. So I was trained to fly bombers. And we flew all kinds of different trainers, and that were not really fast at all. But then we switched to some of the early bombers and got a check out in those. And we had our orders to go, and I was going somewhere to a bomb group. And there was a fellow in line with me waiting to pick up our orders, and he was holding his up, and he said, God, he was a short fellow, and he said, I never wanted fighters. I wanted to be in bombers or transports, and here I'm going to have to go to fighters. And I said, he said, just because of my height. And I said, listen, I know the sergeant that made up these orders, and I know that he likes beer. And I was, of course, teetotaler. And I said, have you got $10? And he said, well, what do you want it for? And I said, you give me $10, and I'll put $10 with it, and we'll walk over to the sergeant. And I've met him before a few times, and I was a sergeant. I was just a plain sergeant. And I told him, I said, you're a sergeant, I'm a sergeant. I said, give me a break. I said, he wants to go to bombers, and you got his listed to go. And I'm going to, I said, I'm going to bombers, he's going to fighters, and can't you reverse it and go get yourself a lot of beer to drink? And he said, well, he said, I don't think I could get away with it. I said, look, the order's already printed. They've been signed off and approved. All you've got to do is give us another copy and swap names. And I said, nobody in the whole world is going to know as many people as are going to be graduating. And he said, well, I think you're right. That's how I became a fighter pilot.
And now, in early 43, so you finally get in combat after test flying 40 types of aircraft in the Mediterranean. So you get into combat, and at one point in Palermo, 100 Italian airplanes surrender to Bob Hoover. How did you pull that one off?
Well, we'll go fast forward. I had joined the 52nd Fighter Group, and by that time I had a wealth of experience. I might back up a little bit.
Sure.
To go to England. In Florida, where we were training on the fighters, the commanding officer I had was not known to us back originally, but he was a hero in the Philippines. He swam to Corregidor from the peninsula that was invaded by the Japanese. And he became a hero at that battle. He had shot down 2 or 3 enemy airplanes, but they were isolated, and the rest of the Philippines, the President and General Eisenhower, were on Corregidor. And he had just finished that battle there. And he came home as a hero, and he was my commanding officer in this fighter training unit. And I was going out on my first mission where he'd watched me fly, and he said, I think we're going to make you a leader, and you'll be helping the people with their flying. And I didn't think of myself as having any ability that was any different from anybody else. But he'd been watching me very close, and he said, the instructors have been telling me that you're highly skilled, more than probably anybody they've ever seen. And I didn't think I was anything. And he was very encouraging, and he said, well, I want you to lead these fellows. And so I'm making you an instructor. And we were in fighters, and all of a sudden I'm teaching people how to fly formation and fire their guns at targets. And he happened to be dropping a container of dye marker and stuff that he'd drop in the water with a little liaison airplane, something like a Cub. It had 2 seats and lots of visibility, and they were used for the ground forces to tell where the firepower was coming from and so forth. But he had one of those, and he happened to be dropping the dye into the water off of Florida there, the coastline, and it would be our target, and then we'd go in and set up a pattern and shoot at it and go around and so forth. And I was leading a flight of P-40s. I think there were about 5 of them, and he had dropped the stuff, and he'd landed at the airplane to see how we were going to, the firing would go from the other planes. And he'd landed and parked it on the sand down in Daytona Beach areas, you know, is dry. They used to race cars on it. You don't sink into the sand. And so he landed on it, and he was watching, and I just pulled off of my target, and the loudest explosion you could imagine. And I was sitting in the middle of a fireball, and I tried to get altitude, and I saw that without the engine, it had blown up. There was no way I was going to get any altitude. I had no choice. I could never get high enough to bail out, so I decided I had to ditch. And so I put it in, and it turned out to be a very smooth landing. But a P-40 has a large scoop. If you look at one here in the museum, it's right up in the nose, right underneath the prop. And that's where you get the air for the cooling on the radiator, because they're liquid-cooled engines. And the tail dragged, and it was a very smooth touchdown in the water. But when it finally lost airspeed like this, and the nose got in the water, it hit that scoop, and it was dragged, and it pulled it straight down like this. And I had the canopy closed because there was all the fire all around me. And I cranked the canopy open real quick as I hit the water, and before I could do anything, even unfasten the safety belt, I took one deep breath, and the airplane was sunk because of the scoop giving me so much drag that it put the nose down. And boy, I thought I was going to choke to death instantly. But I was okay to hang on, and I pulled my safety belt, and on my May West, I pulled the things to put the air to it, and I floated to the top of the surface. And I looked around, and I was in a U-shaped fire, a ring that went like so. And it was oil burning where the tank is, all the oil and everything was all over the water. But it happened to be in a circle. And I came up in the middle of it, and I thought, oh boy, I'm going to get burned up. There's no way out. Then I saw that there was an opening. So it was a U-shaped thing. And I swam as best I could. Still had on my parachute and everything, because when I pulled those things to inflate the May West, it took me to the top with all of this gear hanging on me. And I didn't take time because I was worried about the fire. So I tried to paddle and kick my feet to get to that little opening. And I had seen a fishing boat that I had aimed at when I decided I had to ditch. And I hoped that maybe he would find me, because in a large body of water, you aren't going to see somebody's head sticking up. And I was really thinking ahead. And I got out of the circle, and I had done the right thing. That boat had seen me, and they were headed toward me. And I wasn't out of the fire circle long enough to even think about it. And this little old putt-putt outboard engine came up, and these two fishermen were in it, and a little flat-bottom boat. And they pulled me on board, and they said the airplane had dropped the dies on the beach. We'll take you over there, because I was quite a ways out from anywhere, and he took their little boat right up onto the beach because it's so small. It was those flat-bottom things. And it turned out to be my commanding officer. He'd watched the whole thing. And he said, he said, what do you think made that engine blow up? And I said, well, sir, I have heard from the mechanics that I talked to that they had a new silver bearing in the gearing that was supposed to give you more life and less chances of it failing. And that may be what had happened. It didn't work for some reason. And he said, well, we'll find out tomorrow what went wrong in that engine. And I said, well, I hope we can find out. And he said, well, I'll get the Navy to lift it up with a flat-bottom barge that has a crane, and its water is only about 50 feet where it went down. And he said, we'll go over tomorrow morning and look at it and find out what we can by looking at the airplane. And so I said, yes, sir. Next morning I checked in, and we got in his Jeep and went over to where the airplane was on this flat top, and we looked at it. Was full of 50 caliber holes, and behind you we had a armor plate right here behind your head. It had two places where the rounds of 50 caliber had hit it and then gone sidewise. And we looked at each other, and the airplane was just full of holes. The guy behind me had not seen me. I know what happened, but he asked, my commanding officer then said, why in the world would anybody ever do that? I said, he would never have done it intentionally. I don't know him very well, but I said, but he wouldn't have done that. And I said, he must have had target fixation. And he said, well, I don't care what it was. I hate to see a young man get court-martialed and have his flying career ended. And he said, that's what I've got to do. And I said, well, sir, I said, as I think about it, why would anybody purposely shoot down a friendly airplane? I said, I bet you anything in the world. He had target fixation, and if you court-martial him, I said, that'll be the end of his career. And I think he was probably as eager as I was, or anybody else, to serve our country. And I tell you what I would suggest, sir. I said, why don't you send him out on there are a group of people that are scheduled to be going out to units on a assignment they had to go to some other place in the Air Force organization of some kind. I said, why don't you just put his name on that list, and he'll be out of here before they can hold a session on what happened, or anybody has to examine it or anything. He said, that's food for thought. And he did it. And I never heard of his career, but I hope he was very successful. But my commanding officer then had great enthusiasm for trying to push me, and I was the youngest of 67 fighter pilots, and I was a sergeant because I was too young to be an officer. And half of the guys who I was trained with there, and fighters, but they only had 10 hours in a fighter total time. And I had quite a bit more, enough to be able to hit a target and fly a formation. But they were big, wide formations. And he called everybody together and he said, I've got all of your orders here to go to fight, go to battle. And boy, we were eager beavers to go. And he said, Sergeant Hoover's going to be he'll be in charge of all of you. And I thought, me? And there it was. And if you look in the back of my book, those are the secret orders of me taking 67 pilots, half enlisted men, and half second lieutenants. And I said, how can you? They said, you've done better than anybody else, and you're the leader. I was the youngest and the lowest ranking. Off we went to England. We got to England, and I've got to tell you, it was 3 of the worst days of all of our lives, because we were on the Queen Elizabeth, the fastest ship that could cross the Atlantic Ocean and not be overrun by German submarines. And so we transferred. Those Queen Elizabeth, Queen Mary were just going back and forth. And the ship was designed for 1,200 people, including the crew and the passengers. And it had 18, I think they said 1,800 men on that boat, on that ship. They were on the decks in their sleeping bags for 3 days, and I was at the gymnasium for my 67 pilots, and we were all anchored in there, and they had triple deck bunk beds, and they put me by the door because I was in charge. And there was a colonel on board that I had to report to, and big heavy set guy, and he did the best he could for us, but with that many people on that ship. You were in line to go to the bathroom, you were in line to go get your food, and then you'd get right in the line to wash your mess kit and stuff, and then you go back and sleep on the floor in your sleeping bag. But we were in a bed thing. They put me by the door, and I thought, boy, that's beautiful. I've got the door. I'm out here. I can go to the bathroom and everything. But you never went to the bathroom without standing in line for Lord knows how long, for the food, for cleaning your kit and everything. And we were all filthy. The first thing that happened, I was so pleased about being on the bunk at the bed at the bottom and right by the door. And we hadn't any more than gotten out to sea the next morning. And everybody got seasick. And you know the rest of the story. Who got the mess? The guy on the lower bunks. And I tell you, that place smells so bad. Even by the door, I couldn't get any fresh air enough to keep me from wanting to cover up my face. But you couldn't get rid of the odor. And there was constantly people going in and out of the door and trying to get to the bathroom. Everything was just like that. And for all of our soldiers, it was the same way. And boy, when we got to Scotland and they got us off, every one of us were awful. Our clothes were filthy. We just looked like the worst tramps you've ever seen. But incidentally, this is a strange thing. When they took us from where we were in New York, the first place that we went to before going aboard the ship, well, we were there for about 2 or 3 days, and they said, we're going to change uniforms. And what in the world do they mean change uniforms? I was still wearing my sergeant uniform, and the second lieutenants were wearing what they had, and they said, we want to not have people know that could do things against our forces, and we don't want them to know that you're going to be flying or anything else, and we're going to put you in the suits we have left over from World War I. I'm telling you the truth. And we were then dressed in these old things. They had swelled out things like this, and then you had something down here, and you had these big old high-top shoes. And we all had to get dressed in those before we went from the buses. We had already been told before we got on the bus to go to the ship, to go aboard. And we looked like doughboys from World War I.